Disclaimer: these stories were originally published by Reddit users and are presented as personal experiences. While they're described as true events, their accuracy relies on the original storytellers. The details shared here are intended for awareness and cautionary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised. Story 1. The people upstairs won't stop singing Happy Birthday. It's been 5 hours. I don't usually work on Sundays, but I needed some extra cash, so I took an early shift. I came home at around 2 p.m. I live in this apartment building. My apartment is on the first floor, along with another one that belongs to this dude who's rarely home. There's Mrs. Rogue's place on the ground floor, and then the second floor has 2 other flats, one owned by an elderly couple and the other by this family I don't really see that often, directly above me. Sometimes I hear the kids in the morning moaning about having to get ready for school and then stomping down the stairs. Sometimes I hear hushed voices and dishes clattering. After 10 p.m., everything usually goes quiet. I got to my door, and as I was searching for my keys in my bag, I could hear voices upstairs. They were hushed and a little tense, stressing the words and mixing them together. I couldn't really make out what they were saying, but they seemed to be talking about something really important. Now, keep in mind that I've never seen these people before. I assumed they were a family because I kept hearing the kids and sounds that I generally attribute to a family home. It's not like I've personally met them. I just assumed. Anyway, as I said, I finally got a hold of my keys and unlocked the door. Yet, I didn't immediately step inside after I opened it. I don't know why I let it swing open and remain there listening for 2 more seconds, but I'm somewhat glad I did. The moment the door was heard, the voices upstairs stopped. Completely. As if they were listening to me now. I remained still. We all studied the silence for a while. I heard a singular step on the stairs above. That's when my back went cold and my muscles tensed up for whatever reason. I got the sudden urge to just go inside and shut the door behind me, which I did. Afterwards, I started putting some groceries in the fridge and doing some errand around the house. Faintly at first, then stronger, I started hearing this birthday song upstairs. I smiled inside. They were planning the birthday, man. That's why they were so precautious, so nervous. It sounded like there were around 5 to 6 people singing. Maybe, Happy Birthday, Dear Jonah. That was cute. When they finished, they started again. I did find it weird, but I assumed that the kid had asked for it again. Kids loved blowing out candles and whatever. It was an awfully long song. It kept looping until reaching its conclusion, just like the first time. It had a lot of unnecessary runs and filler and extra lyrics. When they finished, a little pause followed. Then, they started again in the exact same way. Fucking weird family, I thought, and by that time I gotten annoyed, so I just put on my headphones and laid down on the couch. I fell asleep at around 4 or 5 p.m. I woke up from the nap disoriented. Man, after work naps hit the hardest. I'd slept until around 8 p.m., and the sun was peeking at me from behind some buildings, a sunset that was more blue than red, and melancholy and confusion that reminded me of how liminal your house felt when you would go to sleep after school and wake up with a sore throat and a huge pillow mark on your face, with your mood ruined, your mother suddenly calling you out to go to dinner. I swallowed, staring blankly at the window highlighted in gold and rum. I rubbed my eyes, then massaged my face. I stood up to get a glass of water, walked barefoot to the kitchen, which was now sunken in that specific 8 p.m. darkness, and stood still and silent, not knowing what I wanted from my life. Then, I finally registered one important detail. The folks upstairs were still singing Happy Birthday. I listened for a while, unsure of what my reaction should be. I wondered if they had some recording playing on a loop, but that wasn't really the case, as each version sounded different from the previous. They really were weird, or maybe their kid was just eccentric. Maybe they were practicing for some performance. I started thinking. As I said, I hadn't personally met these people before, so I had no idea what they did. Maybe they were really practicing. I put my headphones on and went on trying to make some sort of dinner, even though I wasn't really hungry and my throat still hurt. I ate, watched my show, then took a shower. Their singing had started to piss me off. It was now approaching 10 p.m., and I felt the need to go upstairs and tell them to quit it. I'm not confrontational. I really don't like telling people they upset me, and most don't have an appropriate reaction at all. I didn't want to talk to them, so I called my mom. I started telling her about my day, but she interrupted me, asking about the people upstairs. Yeah, they've been doing it for hours. I don't know, it started to really get on my nerves. Well, go up to them and knock. Aren't the other residents annoyed? The old people upstairs? I'm sure they wanted to sleep by now. Maybe I could just put on some music. That could cover them up. But do you want to listen to music? No, not really. Then why do it to please them? Go upstairs, Michaela. I sighed and reluctantly agreed. After hanging up, I put on a sweater and unlocked my front door. The moment I opened it, the air felt a little colder. I stared at the dark hallway, illuminated by the ray of light from my door and another faint light coming from upstairs. I went up the stairs. The second floor was more animated than the first. The door to the family's apartment was slightly open, and I could see light and movement behind. I slowly approached it, then peeked inside. I could see a hallway with balloons and confetti peacefully floating around. A faint smell of candles and sweetness lingered out. I didn't want to disturb too much, so I tried to be discreet while I quietly and almost imperceptibly pushed the door slightly more. The small hallway made way to a dining room. The shadows were dancing on the walls as people clapped around the table and sang. On the table was a cake with pink and purple frosting, sprinkles, and some writing I couldn't really decipher. The song carried on, but was hoarser than I'd remembered it. People were smiling, swaying from side to side at the person sitting in front of the cake. The lighting was dim and pleasant, its only source being the candles. The people around were a little tense, but overall it reminded me of my own birthdays as a kid. Some boxes lay scattered on the floor. I tried to take a better look at them, or the kid. The child looked like a young boy, with a big birthday hat on. He, I think, could have been 10 or 12, and his face was round and stretched into a big smile. I stared for a while at the teeth. I don't know what prompted me to make that observation, but he had adult teeth, which were rotten and yellow, sticking out of his mouth in abnormal directions. His eyes were wide and red, as if he'd been crying for a while. I don't remember seeing him blink at all in the minutes that I watched that felt like hours. He looked really shaken and tense. I'd never seen a child like that before. Never in my life. All the courage I'd had before peeking through the door had evaporated. I must have zoned out watching the scene when I was pulled away from my trance. The kid shifted his eyes from the candles, which had now almost completely melted, and looked straight at me. I felt like I'd never been before. My heart completely collapsed, leaving a painful knot in my chest as I made eye contact with the child. His smile slowly faded, turning into a grimace. I wanted to run, but I was somehow frozen in place. Suddenly, he blew out the candles, and the room was engulfed in darkness. I heard something shuffle in the dark towards me, gasped and shut the door behind me as I practically jumped down the stairs. The shuffling and scratching followed. I gripped the door and slammed it behind me just as something slammed into it from the other side. Eyes wide and unfocused, I barely managed to lock it as the banging started. The song upstairs had stopped. I looked through the peephole. The hallway was completely dark now, but I could make out the details of the face I'd looked at before in the dimly lit dining room. Only, now we were at eye level, which was impossible since that had been a kid. Had it been just a person? The more I thought, the more I realized I had no idea what prompted me to assume it had been a kid. The round face? Childish clothing? Trying to decipher the memory meant analyzing every detail of that horrible face, a thing I didn't want to do. The banging turned to scratching. I yelled I was going to call the police. My voice died in my throat. The banging was so strong that it was undoubtedly going to break down my door. Suddenly, I heard a distinct sound upstairs. The banging and scratching instantly stopped. It was a door opening. The elderly couple's door. Hey, what on earth are you doing? It is the middle of the night. I watched through the peephole as the kid not a kid walked away from my door upstairs. Quit it before I call the police. It's enough that I have to hear your kids' tantrums every day, lady, but dash. The voice abruptly stopped. I listened, barely breathing. No scream, no sound. Nothing. Faint scratching, then shuffling, then a faint cry that sounded more like 4 sobs. I silently dialed up the police and barely managed to whisper what was going on, afraid that I might be heard. As I was detailing the problem, I looked through the peephole once again to be greeted by that face, grimaced, eyes bloodshot and sunken into the head. "You're welcome to join next year. That's why we left the door open," came the voice of an adult out of the face of a 12-year-old. I gasped and ducked as if that would save me. The police came in around half an hour, which was an insanely long amount of time. They went upstairs and sealed off the entirety of the second floor. They refused to give me details. I had to wait for the headlines and accept some vague answers from the numerous phone calls I'd given since. "Miss, there were never kids living upstairs. 2 of them are grown-ups, but 2 of them were pretending to be kids." They refused to tell me what had happened to the elderly couple. They barely mumbled something that included kidnapping, massacre, disembowelment. Some of the victims, which had been many, were hostages made to play along. The presents were just pieces of flesh, toys made of bones with bows on them. One of them was a tooth necklace. I'm going through a really hard time now, trying to move all my stuff without having to go to that place too often. I can't sell it or rent it out, maybe to some true crime fanatic. I moved in with my parents, but I asked them to add extra locks to their doors and windows and security cameras everywhere. They assumed I was paranoid and suffering from PTSD. I let them believe that. However, I'd watched the security footage of that night, showing the outside of my door. The birthday boy I'd spoken to hadn't gone back upstairs. He just crawled to the window and jumped out. I don't know where he is now. I hope it goes both ways. Story 2. I shouldn't be able to get pregnant as a 34-years-old man. The first flutter was on a Tuesday. I was sitting at my desk, staring at a spreadsheet that had long since dissolved into a sea of meaningless numbers when I felt it. A tiny, bubbling sensation deep in the lower part of my belly, like a goldfish gently bumping against the glass of its bowl. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. It came again, a soft, insistent pop. "Gas," I told myself. "It's just gas. You had that questionable Thai food for lunch." But the Thai food had been 2 days ago, and this felt different, deliberate. That night, lying in the dark of my one-bedroom apartment, I pressed my hand against my stomach. It was firm, a little bloated maybe, but normal. Then I felt it, a distinct, rolling motion, a slow shift of weight from one side to the other. It wasn't gas. Gas doesn't have mass. This did. A cold dread, thick and oily, began to seep into my veins. I was a 34-year-old man. This was impossible. The next morning, I went to see Dr. Evans. He was a good guy, pragmatic, with a calming, no-nonsense demeanor. I sat on the crinkly paper of the examination table, my shirt off, feeling absurd. "So, what seems to be the problem, Alex?" he asked, washing his hands at the sink. I think there's something in my stomach," I said, the words sounding insane the moment they left my mouth. He raised an eyebrow. "Something you swallowed? A foreign object?" "No, not like that. It's alive. I can feel it moving." Dr. Evans did his due diligence. He poked and prodded, listened with his stethoscope, ordered an ultrasound. The technician smeared cold gel on my abdomen and moved the wand around, her face a mask of professional neutrality. On the screen, I saw the grainy black and white landscape of my own insides, the shadow of my liver, the pulsing of my aorta, a blurry glimpse of my intestines. "See," Dr. Evans said, pointing at the screen. "Nothing there. No blockages, no masses. Everything looks perfectly normal. But I can feel it," I insisted, a desperate edge creeping into my voice. He gave me a kind, pitying smile. "Stress, Alex. It could do incredible things to the body, manifest in physical sensations. I'm prescribing you a mild anti-anxiety medication. Try for a few weeks, and let's see if these sensations subside." I took the pills. They made me feel fuzzy and disconnected, like I was watching my life through a pane of dirty glass. But they did nothing to stop the movements. If anything, they grew stronger. The goldfish was becoming an eel, slithering and coiling in the dark, warm cavity of my body. And then it started to grow. It was subtle at first. The slight tightness of my belt. The way my t-shirts stretched a little tighter across my midsection. Within a month, there was no denying it. A low, hard swell had developed below my navel. A bump. A protrusion. I stopped going to the gym. I started wearing baggy hoodies, even in the sweltering summer heat. My friends noticed. "Dude, you putting on a little dad bod?" Mark joked, clapping me on the shoulder at a bar. I flinched away. Just a bit of bloat. The thing inside me didn't like being jostled. It would recoil and then lash out with a sudden, sharp kick that made me gasp. The movements were no longer gentle flutters. They were jabs, rolls, hiccups. I could feel its sleep-wake cycles, its periods of frantic activity, and its times of unnerving stillness. I started doing research. Desperate, late-night Google searches in the blue glow of my laptop. Male pregnancy, cryptic pregnancy, foreign body sensation delusion. The last one led me down a rabbit hole to a word that made my blood run cold. KOVAD syndrome, a psychological condition where a sympathetic partner experiences the symptoms of pregnancy. But I had no partner. Sarah had left me 6 months ago. There was no one to be sympathetic for. This was something else, something new. One night, lying in bed, I felt a rhythmic, fluttering pulse deep inside, right where the thing was nestled. It was too fast to be my own heartbeat. It was a tiny, frantic drumbeat. Thump, 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 thump. A fetal heartbeat. That's when the whispers started. Not from the room, but from inside my own head. A soft, sibilant voice that wasn't my own. Warm, it whispered. Safe. I screamed and clamped my hands over my ears, but it was useless. The voice was coming from here. My apartment began to feel alien. The shadows in the corner of my bedroom seemed to congeal into a tall, watchful presence. I started calling it the Watcher. It was there to observe the miracle or the monstrosity. I was never sure which. Sometimes, from the kitchen, I'd hear the faint, metallic shink of a knife being drawn from a block, but when I'd run in, panting, everything would be in its place. The voice inside me grew more articulate. Hungry, it would say, and a specific bizarre craving would bloom in my mind. The taste of wet charcoal, the salty tang of a battery, the sweet rot of overripe peaches. I find myself in the grocery store, staring at a bag of charcoal briquettes, my mouth watering. They didn't understand. The voice cooed. They're not chosen. You are the vessel. Vessel for what? I sobbed one night, curled on the bathroom floor. For the new world, it replied, its tone one of absolute, serene certainty. I was losing time. I'd come to, standing in the nursery section of a department store, my hand resting on a tiny, yellow onesie. I had no memory of driving there. The Watcher in the shadows of my home was now following me out into the world, a flicker of darkness just at the edge of my vision. I quit my job. I stopped answering my phone. My world shrank to the four walls of my apartment and the growing, living entity inside me. My body was changing in ways that defied biology. My stomach was now a taut, unmistakable dome. My senses were heightened. I could smell the chlorine in the tap water, hear the electrical current humming in the walls. My skin felt stretched and thin as parchment. I was a man, clearly, undeniably pregnant. The due date, a concept that formed with inexplicable certainty in my mind, was approaching. The whispers became a constant, guiding narrative. Soon, the voice promised. Soon you will be empty, and I will be full. The gate will open. I didn't know what that meant, and the terror of it kept me paralyzed. What was I going to give birth to? A messiah? A monster? A new plague upon the earth? The pain started on a Thursday. Not the sharp kicks, but a deep, grinding, rhythmic ache that started in my lower back and wrapped around my swollen middle. Contractions. The voice was silent now. It was preparing. For 3 days, the pains came and went, growing closer together, more intense. I didn't call for help. Who could I call? An ambulance? What would I say? Hello, I'm a man in active labor. Please send a paramedic and an exorcist. On the third night, the storm broke. The pain was astronomical, a universe of agony contained within my body. I was on my bed, drenched in sweat, my vision blurring. I could feel it, the immense, undeniable pressure of something descending, something moving down, ready to be born. The Watcher stood in the corner of the room, a pillar of solid darkness. I could feel its anticipation. With a final, tearing scream that ripped from my throat, I felt a catastrophic, wet release. A sense of profound, horrifying emptiness. It was over. I lay there, panting, weeping, waiting for the cry of a newborn or the gibbering of an abomination. There was only silence. Slowly, trembling in every limb, I looked down. There was no baby, no monster, no blood, no afterbirth. My stomach was flat, completely, utterly normal. The massive, hard dome was gone as if it had never been. The physical evidence of my pregnancy had vanished in an instant. But on the sheets between my legs, there was a single, small object. I reached for it, my hand shaking so badly I could barely grasp it. It was a small, smooth, gray river stone, still warm from the inside of my body. From the corner of the room, the watcher dissipated, its purpose fulfilled. The voice in my head was gone. The apartment was silent, save for my ragged, broken breaths. I held the stone in my palm. It was just a rock, meaningless. But as I stared at it, a final, fleeting whisper echoed in the hollowed-out cavern of my mind, the last vestige of the presence that had inhabited me for 9 months. The seed is planted. I sit here now, in a different apartment. The doctors call it a psychotic break, a uniquely elaborate somatic delusion rooted in my schizophrenia, likely triggered by the trauma of my breakup and the loneliness that followed. They say the brain, under immense stress, can manufacture any sensation, any belief. They have me on a powerful antipsychotic. The watcher hasn't returned. The voice is silent. They gave me the stone back after my evaluation. They thought it was a comfort object. I keep it in a small wooden box on my dresser. Most days, I can almost believe them. Most days, I can function. But sometimes, late at night, I take the stone out of the box. I hold its cool, smooth weight in my hand, and I feel a terrible, undeniable truth. It's warmer than it should be, and if I press it to my ear, I can just barely hear it, a faint, slow, and steady thump, thump, thump. Story 3. My uncle was in the Vietnam War. He finally told me what had happened to him over there. My Uncle Trent died last week. The official cause of death was cirrhosis. He was 75 years old. Quite frankly, he made it much longer than any of us have been expecting. I know how callous that sounds, but it is what it is. I never put down the bottle. I had been really young at the time, but from what my dad had told me, Trent had been a perfectly happy guy up until the day he left for Vietnam. He'd had a lot of friends, had been popular with women, maintained good relationships with family, and had a degree in civil engineering. Such a far cry from the person that had come back that we almost wanted to question whether or not he'd been replaced. After he returned to the U.S., he decided to just stop participating in life. A spiritual suicide of sorts. He broke up with his girlfriend, never applied to any jobs, never reached out to friends or family, never had any hobbies or seemed to do anything at all. He rented a small studio apartment on the edge of town and just stayed in there, drinking and smoking the days away. It was a mystery how he always seemed to have enough money to cover his expenses. For a while, I just assumed that either my dad or grandfather had been subsidizing him from afar. But I would later learn that wasn't the case. Never had he asked them for money. Even when they'd offered some to him with no strings attached, he had refused, telling them he didn't need it. I try to visit him every now and then, but my motivation to do so really dwindled near the end. I'd like to think it wasn't because I was a terrible nephew or anything. It was just hard to talk to the guy, hard to deal with him. After every visit, I would walk away with this terrible taste in my mouth. And it wasn't just from breathing in the booze fumes and cigarette smoke. He never seemed willing to reciprocate any sort of conversation, never said more than a few words at a time. He'd always just stare ahead at the television, and I couldn't tell if he were actually paying attention to what was on the screen or if he were just dissociating. There were moments where it almost seemed like he wanted to tell me something. He'd look away from the screen and stare at me with this tortured expression, as if he desperately wanted to get something off his chest, but just couldn't bring himself to do it. He'd open his mouth as if ready to speak, and then nothing. Always nothing. So you can imagine how shocked I was when I got a call from my mother telling me that Trent wanted to see me, that he wanted to talk to me about something. I'm sure my dad would have been the one to tell me, but he passed from cancer a few years back. At first, I wasn't so sure how I felt about the idea. After all these years, all of my efforts to try and get through to him, and now he finally wanted to talk, I wanted to be more pissed off than I actually was. But in truth, I still had some grace left to spare the guy. Maybe he'd realized that his time left on Earth was short and regretted pushing so many people away. Perhaps this was an attempt at some kind of closure. At the same time, I couldn't deny how curious I was. Maybe he'd finally tell me what had happened over there, though I wasn't totally convinced that I wanted to know. I drove over to his apartment and knocked on his door. I heard him coughing inside before telling me that the door was unlocked. To come right in. My first time entering the place in over a decade, and it smelled and looked so much worse than I had remembered, a sense of heavy despair floating around in the air. Trent was sitting on the same couch he always had, though now it looked like it belonged in a landfill. Cracks in the paint, stains all over. Spread out across the old coffee table in front of him were several beer cans, liquor bottles, cigarette butts. The smell of mold and rot was nearly overpowering the smoke. He turned around, and it's hard to understate the dread I felt looking at his face. Hard to see him in such a state. Made me feel like an asshole for not doing more to help. But I had tried. A lot of us had. I walked over and sat down on the couch beside him. I asked him how he was feeling. He shook his head, told me not to bother, that I didn't need to pretend, that he was sick but not senile, that he was well aware of the costs of his behavior over the last 50 or so years and didn't blame any of us for no longer wanting to deal with him. But it wasn't an accident. It had been a very calculated decision. Hearing him say all this caught me off guard. From what I could recall, this was the longest conversation we'd ever had. And even more surprising was how lucid he seemed. I thought that decades of alcohol abuse would have taken more of a toll. But here he was, eyes and voice as earnest as anybody I'd seen before. I told him that I had no doubts he had experienced things more terrible than I could have imagined. But he never had to deal with it alone. We had been there for him. So why had he chosen a life of solitude? And this is where the conversation took a strange turn. Trent took a long exhale and looked around the apartment. Then he said it was because he never wanted to put any of us in danger. I stared at him and asked what he meant by that. What kind of danger? He told me he wasn't exactly sure, which was why it scared him so much. He claimed that if he were to tell me what had happened to him, I needed to be ready to deal with the consequences. That once I was privy to such knowledge, it would complicate my life in ways that would be hard to deal with. That I'd likely be forced to look over my shoulder for the rest of my years. But if I was prepared to take that risk, then I should pour myself some whiskey and get ready to listen. Hearing him say these things made my heart drop, not because I believed him, but because it all but confirmed his deteriorating state of mind. Articulate as he still was, he was clearly no longer there. I decided to humor him. I smiled, told him that I was willing to take the risk. But once the words left my mouth, I could see his expression sour. "You don't believe me," he said. "You think these are the ramblings of a man gone wild." I didn't expect the immediate pushback. I didn't know what to say, and so I began stumbling over my words, searching for an answer. "I don't blame you," he continued. "I don't. I know I'm near the end. I know my mind's nearly gone. But this is something that even in death, I'll never forget. You want to know why I drink? It's because if I don't, then it's all I can think about. All I can dream about." He paused and lit up a cigarette and took several long drags before staring at me. "Knowledge can be a burden. If you're going to hear this, then I need to know that you believe me, that you've accepted the risk. Otherwise, we can just forget about it. You can go on and live your life with no worries." I still wasn't sure what to think, but my curiosity had started to burn. I asked him why he even wanted to tell me about it. If it was so dangerous, then why didn't he just keep it to himself? He said that he didn't have a good answer to that. He just felt like somebody needed to know what had happened before it died with him. He said that there exists a darkness in this world that's beyond anything we've been taught, anything we were familiar with, anything we had the ability to understand. And one day, we might have to deal with it. It was the spring of 1967. He was in the Central Highlands, part of a platoon of about 30 trekking through deep jungle. Their objective had been to make contact with a French intelligence officer named Bernier, who would then guide them to a sizable NVA camp that they were meant to ambush and subsequently commandeer. Simple directives, but to actually execute them without dying or getting maimed would have been some Herculean feat at that point. He'd already witnessed 23 others face a variety of gruesome ends. He remembered that exact number, because each one had been burned so deep into his psyche that it was hard not to keep a tally. Every moment spent in the jungle put him on edge. He was always paranoid, tired, scared. He said it had to be some version of hell. That particular day, the air had been hot and thick, a heavy sun blazing above. Mosquitoes were constantly swarming around their heads, while ants were constantly crawling up their boots. His arms were heavy from hacking away bamboo and large rattan vines. He could smell moss, earth, sharp and acrid odors from wildlife, sweat and gun oil from wafting off his fellow draftees. His feet ached hot and wet in his boots. Trench foot had become a common issue, and he feared it would reach him soon. They had been walking for a long time. How long exactly he couldn't tell for sure, but he said it had felt longer than anything he'd ever done before. When night came, they slept on the ground, covering themselves with thin poncho liners. Of course, sleep didn't come, for any of them. As he laid on the soil, he could hear no snoring. He could hear nothing at all. Nothing. You could have heard a pin drop, which was unusual, so much so that he sat up the moment he realized this. Soon most everybody else was awake as well. He looked around in the darkness, though he wasn't sure what he was supposed to be looking for. But he could feel the hairs standing tall on the back of his neck, as if it were meant to be a signal that they were in the presence of something dangerous. They turned their flashlights on, and the soldiers stared between each other, as if their fellow man might have an answer for this strange thing they were all feeling. Before long, something shattered the silence. They all grabbed their rifles and stood, though none could make sense of the noise. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere above them. They looked up, and eventually one of their lights caught movement, something crawling down one of the trees. He said that it felt like his brain was short-circuiting when it tried processing what he was seeing. It was a human figure crawling on all fours down the trunk. That wasn't right. That couldn't be right. They weren't able to get a good look at the creature/person before it leapt onto a different tree. And then another. Soon it was bouncing between the trees at an unnervingly fast pace, and it wasn't much longer before the first shot was fired. Chaos erupted as erratic streams of gunfire cracked through the night. There was a lot screaming, a lot of scrambling. They were dealing with just a singular target, but one that seemed impossible to hit. At one point, the figure had jumped onto the tree directly behind Trent. He turned around, shining his light on what looked to be a pale, naked, emaciated man. His eyes were sunken in, the skin on his face stretched tight across the skull. He had bushy eyebrows and thick dark hair, hanging off of a branch with one arm, like a primate. He was staring directly at Trent and smiling. His teeth were large, terribly rotten, small worms wriggling around between them. He said that his face was no further than a few feet away from his own, and he could see it so clearly that the image was instantly burned into his head, something incapable of being forgotten. He fumbled for his rifle, but by the time he had it steady in his hands, the man had leapt away into the darkness. A piercing, foul stench lingered in the air, something like sour milk mixed with a strange industrial element. It was so intense that it made him tear up. The entire platoon stayed awake for the rest of the night. When the sun came up, they marched on deeper into the jungle. The morning was spent moving in silence. Nobody quite knew what to say, but after a while, somebody suggested that they head back. It was a request that was shut down fairly quickly by Gutierrez, their platoon leader. Real hard-nosed guy. He said they had a job to do, that they were obligated by national duty to see it through no matter what. But he didn't sound so sure about it. His words lacked conviction, as if he had tried, but failed to convince himself that he wasn't confused and terrified. They moved on. Trent said that the sun seemed brighter that day, a cloudless sky above. The boiling temperatures, coupled with the sleep deprivation, proved to be one hell of a thing. At around noon, they came across two corpses sprawled out on the ground. NBA soldiers. And the only reason they were able to figure this out was due to the SKS carbines laid out beside them. The actual bodies were indistinguishable, mutilated to a degree where they hardly resembled people at all. Dozens of chunks of flesh had been torn away. Several limbs were missing, as if they had been ripped straight off. They were ready to believe that it could have been the work of a tiger or a wild boar until they saw a third body dangling by its entrails from one of the tree branches, about 50 feet above. Still, Gutierrez insisted that it was just that. An animal. That the thing from a night before had also been an animal. That there was nothing weird going on, and they had nothing to worry about. A few soldiers out of the platoon seemed ready to accept this. But the larger majority weren't. Somebody suggested that they abort the mission. Several more occurred. Gutierrez pushed back, claiming that they were closer to meeting up with Bernier than they were to the barracks, so they may as well continue on. A lot of arguing ensued. Emotions flared, things got heated. Ultimately, they had a vote. 7 of them wanted to turn back while the rest thought it better to press on. Those 7 ended up going back on their own. Trent admitted that he had considered going with them, until he considered the logistics of it. They had no chance of making it back before nightfall. Better to go with strength in numbers. By the time that the sun had started to set again, the tension in the air was almost palpable. He said that his legs felt heavy and the blisters on his feet had started to open. But he pressed forward, doing his best to keep up with the group. At some point, somebody walked up next to him. He introduced himself as Duncan and then asked whether or not he'd seen it. Trent asked him what that was supposed to mean. Seen what? The man that had been jumping between the trees, Duncan told him. He wanted to know whether or not Trent had gotten a good look at his face. Trent nodded, telling him that he had. Duncan then asked him to describe their appearance. As Trent did so, his face went pale. He told him that he'd seen what looked to be the same man around 10 minutes ago. He had been crouched down in the brush a few dozen feet behind the group, just staring at them as they walked. Duncan was about to shout at him when he suddenly disappeared, sinking into the ground. Those were the precise words he'd used. Sunk straight down into the dirt. They mentioned this to Gutierrez, but he brushed them off, told them to keep moving and to keep staying alert. But his eyes contradicted his words. They could see the fear in them, the disbelief, the panic he was trying desperately to suppress. An uncomfortable feeling spread amongst them as the sky began to darken, because they should have already made contact with Bernier several hours ago. Gutierrez tried to rationalize this by claiming that they'd been moving too slow, that in order to make up for their lack of pace, they needed to press forward through the night. No setting up camp. And this is where things started to boil over. The rest of the platoon told him there was no way in hell that was happening. They were well over 40 hours without sleep in this blasted jungle, and their bodies were ready to collapse. They needed a rest. But Gutierrez wasn't so convinced. He told them that they could set up camp if they wanted to, but that he'd go ahead and make contact with Bernier himself. They tried explaining to him how bad of an idea that was, but he was too stubborn, too delirious to be placated. He ended up marching forward into the darkness alone. Nobody else joined him. They began setting up for the night, and Trent volunteered to be part of the first night shift watch. Not because he wasn't tired. He certainly was. He said it felt like his eyeballs had been left out to dry for a week in the sun. But he also knew that as long as he was out in the jungle, he wasn't getting a lick of sleep. Not after everything that had happened. The first hour or so was uneventful. He just sat there, looking up at the stars and listening to the near-deafening droning of the crickets, cicadas, whatever else was out there. He said that it managed to somewhat put him at ease, because the bugs were part of the natural environment. This is where they belonged. But the peace didn't last much longer. Soon the silence had returned. He said it was like a switch had been flipped. He couldn't explain it. In fact, there seemed to be no possible explanation at all. Even though there was no explicit threat, they all grabbed their rifles. Though they kept their lights off, not because anybody had ordered them to do so. It just happened to be a decision they all collectively arrived at, as if turning them on might expose them to whatever the hell was out there. But nothing happened. The silence persisted, and they were left in limbo, fingers itching their triggers but without a target to aim for. Eventually, somebody pointed out something strange. A hole in the ground in front of them. The stars were bright enough that they didn't need to ask what he was talking about. They could all see it without issue. And it was just that. A hole in the ground. It was a perfect pitch-black circle about the size of a manhole cover. They all just stared at it. Trent said he was really tempted to start shooting, but at what? What was supposed to happen here? Suddenly, something came flying out of it, as if somebody had been standing down in the hole and tossed it up. It was a body, horrifically mangled like the others. They looked back at the hole and saw it had disappeared. Then they looked back at the body. Despite the extent to which it had been mutilated, they were still able to tell exactly who it was. Gutierrez. They had been around him long enough for their brains to be able to fill in the missing details. It looked like the entire left side of his face had been brutally cleaved off, though they couldn't be sure what exactly had done it. Maybe a large set of teeth. Maybe a saw. He had one eye that remained intact, and it was stuck wide open, frozen into a perpetual look of terror. Trent had been hoping that the sleep deprivation had caused him to start hallucinating. But to his disbelief, everybody else confirmed that they were seeing the same thing. Gutierrez's body had actually been tossed up from a hole in the ground, a hole that was now no longer there. He said that he didn't remember falling asleep that night, but that he must have done so at some point, because he remembered waking up in the daylight to the sound of something sizzling, the smell of meat, garlic, and onions. He sat up, rubbed his eyes. He stared ahead and saw a man crouched over a makeshift fire pit just a few feet away from where he'd been laying, using a stick to push around what looked like cubed slices of meat in a frying pan. He was wearing a windbreaker, cargo pants, and boots. He wasn't carrying a weapon. Soon the rest of the platoon was awake as well. But nobody said a word. They all just stared at the guy, as if doing anything to catch his attention may end up proving dangerous. Eventually the man put the stick down and turned to face them. Trent told me that the moment he saw his face, he had to swallow down the bile that was shooting up his throat. He appeared to be around 6'6", but deathly frail at the same time, to the point where it looked like a strong wind may cause him to sway. His skin was a shade of paper and pulled so tight against his skull that it almost looked like a mask. Everything about him was wrong, like some strange attempt to replicate a human, but one that hadn't gone quite right. It was the same guy from the other night. He said there was no mistake. The man stared at them for a while before smiling, revealing a set of sewage-colored teeth. A familiar stench came wafting through the air. Trent locked eyes with Duncan. He looked petrified. The man introduced himself as Bernier. He said it was nice to finally meet everyone. Nobody responded to him, and nobody moved. There came an uncomfortably long stretch of silence that was broken only when Bernier asked if anybody was hungry. Trent said they were surely all starving, but none said a word. They still hadn't overcome the initial shock. He looked around for Gutierrez's body, but it was no longer there. The man insisted that they try some of the beef that he'd cooked up, that they'd need the energy for the long trek ahead. Despite his strange appearance, the man's voice was normal enough, but his accent wasn't French. They couldn't tell exactly what it was. The man then reached behind his back and pulled out a large bottle of water. But he must have grabbed it out of thin air because wasn't carrying a rucksack. Wasn't carrying anything at all. Trent stared closely at the bottle and saw pieces of ice floating around in it, despite it being close to 90 degrees out. The man held it forward, asked if anybody was thirsty. Trent said his throat felt like sandpaper, but he said nothing. The man just kept holding it out, continuing to ask if anybody needed a drink. Eventually, somebody walked forward, seemingly ready to accept the offer. But Trent stepped in front of him, told him not to. He said that he wasn't sure where the sudden audacity had come from, that it was more of a visceral reaction. A primal needs to protect his fellow man from danger. He said he was 100% certain it wasn't water in that bottle. The soldier looked confused, but didn't seem willing to fight him on it. He backed away. Suddenly, the man's smile dropped, and he turned to look at Trent. He said to me that he had never seen such an expression of hatred before, that there was a kind of cruelty behind the eyes that seemed to transcend reality. But it lingered for only a few seconds before the smile returned. Trent said that he thought he could see some kind of worm trying to squirm out of his mouth through a gap in his teeth. The man placed the bottle on the ground and said it was there for anybody to take, but they better move on, because they had a long trek ahead. He took a few steps to the side, as if to make way for one of them to take the lead. Behind him was a path that Trent hadn't noticed before, a clean break in the vegetation. Way too clean. It looked unnatural, made even more so by the fact that it was too dark to see into, as if the space were swallowing every trace of sunlight. Once again, the man told them that they'd better start moving, that they had a long trek ahead. But nobody moved. At that point, every man in the platoon had come to an unspoken understanding that before them stood an utterly evil presence. that under no circumstances could they give him what he wanted. So they just stared at him, unsure of how else to proceed. The man stared back at them, and they could see his smile slowly fading. He began repeating himself, the agitation escalating in his voice with each iteration. Better start moving. Long trek ahead. As if that were one of the few phrases he knew how to say. They didn't know what to do. They were all too terrified and bewildered by the man to try and confront him. So they just stood there, watching him. After what felt like an hour, they could hear the whirring of helicopter blades in the distance, heading their direction. Trent said that the relief he felt upon hearing it was nearly euphoric. The man looked up at the sky and then back down at them. Now that hateful expression has returned. He clenched his jaw tight, and Trent was nearly convinced that he was priming himself to leap at them. But then he turned, walked into the darkness of the path. Trent blinked, and the man was gone. And so was the path. Just gone in an instant, as if they had both never been there. They might have been able to rationalize the whole thing as some mass hallucination caused by some kind of experimental gas that was being tested on them. But the frying pan and the bottle were still there. The fire was still going, the meat now burnt to blackened scraps. Just a few minutes later, they watched as several helicopters descended down into a nearby clearing. Shortly after, they were all extracted back to base. Of course, they had a lot of questions, but no matter how many they asked, they weren't getting any answers back. They were simply told to sit in the barracks and wait. But for what? What the hell had just happened? After a while, each member of the platoon was questioned individually by men in suits. CIA agents, he assumed, though he couldn't confirm this. Trent said that describing what had happened out loud made him want to question whether or not any of it was real. It all just seemed so absurd, but the suits didn't seem to think so. They listened intently to everything he had to say. Nothing in their tones, expressions, or language suggested that they were incredulous about any of it, which freaked him out even more. At one point, he asked them point blank who the hell this man was. The suits told him that they didn't know, that they'd never been able to find out. The next day, they were all put on a flight back to the U.S. They were simply told that they'd satisfied their obligations, that their tour of duty was officially over. But they knew this wasn't true, because the standard length of a tour was 12 months, and they hadn't even been there for 8. But nobody questioned it. They were all just happy to get the hell out of there. Trent took a taxi home from the airport. Once it pulled up to his building, he saw another suit standing in front of his door. The guy flashed him a CIA badge and introduced himself as Miller. Then he asked if they could go inside and have a quick chat. Trent said that the guy didn't seem threatening or anything, but there was a strange energy coming off of him, something that he couldn't quite wrap his head around. Once they were up in his unit, Miller opened the briefcase he'd been carrying and took out a large stack of papers. Trent told him that if he expected him to read through all of that, he was out of his mind. Miller laughed, told him that this was just a consequence of bureaucracy, but he'd go ahead and quickly summarize everything he needed to know. The government was going to pay him $6,000, which would have inflated to about $55,000 today, in benefits per year for the rest of his life. These benefits would be adjusted for inflation as long as he remained alive. The only condition was that he could never talk about what he'd seen in Vietnam. Absolutely no mention of the man to anybody. The second that he did so, they cut him off. All he needed to do was sign. Trent said that he'd tried squeezing some more information out of Miller, but the guy was stone-like. He wouldn't budge. He'd asked him what would happen if he didn't sign it. Maybe he wanted to tell the world exactly what he'd seen. Maybe it'd make him famous, and he'd be able to make a career out of it. In response, Miller had told him they could raise that number to $7,500 a year. Trent asked him what they were so afraid of. Why didn't they want this information out there? Miller told him that wasn't his concern. But if he were dying for some kind of answer and couldn't deal with not having one, then he'd go ahead and put it succinctly. There were certain things that the public were better off not knowing. It'd be easier for them. It would introduce less chaos and allow society to run as smoothly as possible. It wasn't that they were purposefully trying to keep civilians in the dark. They were just trying to protect them. By the end of their conversation, Trent had managed to get him up to $11,000. He still hadn't fully accepted what Miller was trying to tell him. He'd gone back and forth with him for nearly half an hour. But he was tired. He didn't want to deal with it anymore. He didn't want to think about it. The silver lining was that he wouldn't be homeless anytime soon, because there was no way he would have been able to go to work after this. At least not for a long while. He tried to focus on the positives. Now he had free time to do what he pleased. He could travel the world. He could start a business. But for the next few weeks, he did nothing at all, because he couldn't stop thinking about the man. It was all he could focus on. He found a way around it through liquor. He drank at every meal. Then he was drinking between meals. And then every hour on the hour from noon to midnight. And it was working. He was out partying so much that he wasn't thinking about it anymore. One day, he was feeling generous and offered to fly my dad out to Hawaii. They'd lay on the beach, drink until they puked, etc. For the first few days, they were having a great time. It was paradise. And then one evening, they were laying on the beach. The sky was starting to turn a beautiful shade of orange. About 80 degrees, the cool wind starts to prickle the sweat on their skin. As it got darker, the beach slowly began to empty out. They had nowhere else to be, so they stayed, waiting for the sunset. He'd become buzzed enough that he began to tell my dad about everything that had happened. He said that keeping it pent up inside was starting to kill him. He had to let it out. He had to tell somebody. And if there was anybody he could trust, it would have been Dad. But he didn't get far with it, stopping right before he could describe the first encounter. Because that's when he noticed the figure out in the water. Everybody else had left, but this person remained, standing about knee-deep in the ocean. Just standing there. The figure appeared to be tall, lanky. Trent said it looked like they were wearing pants and a jacket, though they were a bit too far for him to make out any more details beyond that. But it was freaking him out, because what the hell were they doing? He leaned forward and squinted ahead until he was able to make out what they looked like. The realization washed over him like a cold wave. He stood up and told my dad that they needed to leave. Then he ran all the way back to the hotel room and drank until he passed out. He told me it had been the same man from the jungle, wearing the same clothes. When I asked him how he could be so sure of that, he told me it was unmistakable. That was a face he'd never forget. Afterwards, he had reached out to other members of the platoon. The few that rode him back told him that they'd also seen the man since coming back. One of them had even seen him all the way out in Italy. And in each instance, they had been on the cusp of divulging the details of what happened in the jungle to somebody else, as if the man had somehow preempted their thoughts and showed up before they could. Then he began hearing some stranger things through the grapevine, like how the bodies of the 7 soldiers that had turned back had been found a week later. They had all been smashed together into a mound of rotting flesh that had then been gruesomely stuffed into a foxhole. He also heard that the government had done a deep dive into Bernier's background, along with correspondence that had taken place between them months earlier. They'd found weird inconsistencies, things that just didn't add up, like the fact that the French military contacts they thought they had been talking to didn't actually exist. That every name and rank had been fabricated, but that it had been done so well they just hadn't caught it until much later. But now the French were denying Bernier's existence outright. He had never been an officer, never been part of the military. They couldn't confirm records of any schooling or who his parents were, or if he was even born on French soil. But then he also heard reports about a man fitting Bernier's physical description who had escaped from a prison in Egypt a few years earlier. It was a notable enough event because there weren't many people in Egypt who looked like him, and escaping from a prison over there was next to impossible. He heard some other stuff as well, but at some point, it all just became too much. Trying to process it all was starting to drive him mad. No matter where he went, he couldn't stop himself from looking over his shoulder. Soon he'd stopped going anywhere at all, save for the bar down the street. And he sure as hell never talked about Vietnam again. Until now. And that was it. That was his story. He hoped it had managed to shed some light on things. Mainly that isolating himself hadn't been a personal thing. He said he hoped that I understood, and that he still appreciated the efforts I made to try and talk to him. And then he told me he was sorry, that I was now in danger. I asked him how he could be so sure. Maybe after all these years, the man was gone. Maybe he died, or maybe he just moved on. Trent said he knew that wasn't the case, because he could see the man right now. He was staring at us through the window. I turned to look at the window, and for a split second, I could see what appeared to be somebody's head peeking up at us near the bottom of the glass. But then I blinked and they were gone. Trent lived on the 7th floor. I called the cops despite Trent telling me not to. They searched the area but couldn't find anything. They told me that maybe it had just been a trick of the light, but to call again if I saw anything else. I didn't feel comfortable leaving Trent alone for the night, so I told him that I'd sleep in the guest room. He protested against it, telling me there was no need. But I insisted, because I could see the fear in his eyes. He was terrified. Of course, I didn't get any sleep that night. But the sun came up, and I never heard anything strange. When I tried to wake up Trent the next morning, I wasn't able to. There was a cool breeze in the room, and I noticed that the window was open. I sure as hell hadn't left it open, and I doubt that Trent would have opened it. I called an ambulance, and they took him away. Later, I learned that he was pronounced dead at the hospital. Sudden, acute liver failure. A sensible enough explanation. But the circumstances just didn't sit right with me. The funeral was only a week later. A really quick, impromptu venue. There weren't many who showed up. Other than my mom, my sister, and myself, there were some estranged relatives, a few of his drinking buddies, and then one other man that nobody else seemed to recognize. He was wearing an old windbreaker jacket and cargo pants that seemed too baggy for his frame. Although he was sitting down, I could tell that he was quite tall. His skin was pale, his features bizarre, and uncanny enough that I couldn't help but stare. What freaked me out even more was that I never actually remembered seeing him show up. It's like he just suddenly appeared. For a while, I thought I might have been hallucinating the guy, until my sister made a remark about how much he was freaking her out. It was an open casket funeral, and the moment that they brought Trent's body out, the man was gone. I didn't see him leaving either. Ever since the funeral, strange things have been happening. It feels like I'm being followed. I'm seeing the same black SUV parked wherever I go. One time I looked through the peephole of my apartment in the middle of the night and caught somebody in a suit standing outside my door. Not the same man from the funeral, although I've been seeing him as well. Walking behind me in public, stalking me around grocery stores, sitting a few tables over in cafes and restaurants. I don't know what the fuck wants from me. I don't know what to do about him. But now I understand what Trent had meant. That knowledge isn't always a good thing. That sometimes it can be dangerous. Story 4. I saw myself in the basement. My dad used to work for the military supply chain repair, or something like that. His projects were assigned all around the country, which meant my family had to move around a lot. I basically grew up eating at highway diners and late-night buffets, living in motels, small 2-bedroom apartments, and if we were lucky, a rental house with a big kitchen area. His assignments always took 2 to 3 weeks. The only cities where we stayed for more than a month were New Orleans and Salem. Salem was his last job. After that, he quit. That same day, he told us he was a mess. I'm not sure what happened on that last job, but something got to him. We left town during the night and kept driving for days, stopping to sleep in the shadiest motels. I'm not sure Dad ever slept. Every night, when I woke up, he was frozen, sitting still at the edge of his bed, looking at the door, waiting for something. 2 months later, we arrived in El Paso, Texas. 6 months later, my mom left. Nothing ever came. That was 1 year ago. I'm still homeschooled, learning over the weekends and getting ready to present my SATs by next summer. I help out around the house with chores like cleaning, cooking, and doing laundry. My dad doesn't like people coming over. In fact, he doesn't like talking to anybody. Dad found a job at a Vulcanizadora, a tire repair shop for you gringos. He leaves me alone every day from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. That's when I use his computer. He doesn't know I've figured out his password. The books I use to study are old. The youngest one is from the 1980s, so I always have to double-check things online. Texan nights during October are normally mild, especially in a border town like ours. But last night, it was freezing. I woke up at around 2 a.m., shaking. I could see my own breath and hear the windows cracking from the cold. Something was off. I couldn't go back to sleep. There was an emptiness in the air. I could hear my own blood scraping through my veins. Sometime later, I heard a loud bang coming from downstairs, followed by my dad's muffled voice shouting something. It made no sense to me, just gibberish. My reflexes kicked in, and I stood up. I reached for the door, and as I opened it, my mind went black. Next thing I knew, it was morning. I hurried downstairs, but there was no sign of my dad. The only thing I saw was a note on the fridge that said, "Do not go down to the basement." What the fuck happened last night was the only thought in my head. I knew this wasn't normal. I had to go down. I just had to. The door to the basement was locked. It took me 40 minutes to open it with a butter knife, accidentally popping one of the pins from the door hinge. The door unlocked. I took my time going down the stairs. Our basement is gray and full of cardboard boxes and some flat tires my dad brought home from the shop. There's an old light bulb hanging from the center of the room. When I reached the bottom, I flipped the switch on. As my eyes adjusted to the light, I saw a big shadow with an overwhelming presence. The shadow shrank and centered in the middle of the basement. And then I saw it. Something was sitting there, naked, head covered with a bag, on a wooden chair. The bag looked directly at me. I could feel the eyes analyzing me. It expelled a shriek. Its body started to twitch, its limbs shortening, its frame twisting. I could hear bones cracking, the creature screaming in pain. 10 minutes passed. I just stood there, unable to move, unable to look away. Then its body started changing, becoming like mine. The birthmark on my right shoulder. The moles in the shape of the constellation my mother used to point out. They appeared. On its shoulder. Everything became mine, even the private parts. I ran, upstairs, slamming the basement door with all my strength. The hinges were loose, and the door fell halfway. I didn't care. I ran to my room and locked myself in. Hours later, another bang, echoed from downstairs. I rushed down again. The basement door had completely fallen. Must have been the loose hinges, right? It's 7 p.m. as I write this, and my dad is still not home. Story 5. I work as a data entry clerk for a small insurance company. My name is Sean. I work as a data entry clerk for a small insurance company. Every day, I sit at my desk surrounded by towering stacks of paperwork. The task of inputting data into the computer has become a mindless routine. Staring at my computer screen, my eyes begin to feel heavy as I reach for my coffee. I take a sip of my mocha coffee before returning to work. Thankfully, the coffee seemed to do the trick. I spent hours typing, but it felt like minutes. As I looked at the neat stack of paperwork I had just finished, I felt something like a sense of pride. However, that warm feeling was replaced with cool dread as I saw the remaining towers of papers I needed to work on. I was tired, but I knew that I had a deadline. So I grabbed my coffee and took a sip. To my surprise, what I expected to taste and what I tasted were completely different things entirely. I was expecting to taste mocha, but when I took a sip of my coffee, the coffee was caramel. I hated caramel flavoring. I spit the vile liquid out and turned my cup, assuming I had somehow swapped cups with someone else. However, what I saw when I turned my cup confused me. The cup had my name on it. I didn't have time to think too deeply into it. I didn't want to fall behind on my work. So I tossed the coffee cup into the green trash bin under my desk and got back to it. I typed for hours and watched as my coworkers went home for the evening. The workday ends at 4, but it was dark when I finished my work for the day. As I made my way outside, I called a cab. I always call the same cab company when I get off work late. The driver for the night shift is always friendly, and after many rides together, I consider him my friend. I sat on the bench outside, and as I waited, I wanted to pull out a cigarette when next to the pack, I felt a piece of paper in my pocket. Curious, I fished the paper out of my pocket, and upon further inspection, I realized that it was a receipt for the coffee I had purchased earlier. The receipt read, 1 large mocha coffee. Isn't that odd? I thought to myself. My thoughts of confusion, however, were cut short as I heard a car approaching. I looked up to see my favorite cab driver pulling up to the curb. I had a long day for sure, but at least now I was with a friend. I waved and smiled at him. He didn't wave or smile back. He might have even looked annoyed. Despite his seemingly annoyed state, as I entered the cab, I was excited to talk with the driver. However, this time, the cab felt different. The once warm and friendly cab driver that I had many enjoyable conversations with in the past now averted his gaze when he caught me studying him in the rearview mirror as we rode in silence. A silence only broken once. I asked how his day was, and he never answered. The only time the driver spoke to me was to verify that we were at the drop-off destination. I looked through the window and saw that we were. I thanked the driver and tipped him as usual. After I paid him, he quickly drove away as if he was in a hurry, and I wondered what had happened to change the demeanor of such a formerly friendly man. I walked up to my apartment building, and as I approached the door to the lobby, I could hear my neighbors fighting inside. I looked through the window and saw one of my neighbors, an elderly man, in a fist fight with another tenant in the building. I hurriedly turned my key in the door and rushed inside. When I entered, I found that the lobby was completely empty. Not only was there nobody fighting, there wasn't anyone there at all. Just me in a state of fight or flight, completely by myself. I felt foolish for a moment and decided that I really just needed a rest. I passed the other apartments before quietly slipping into my apartment. After stumbling to my bed, I fell asleep almost instantly. I felt the world fade around me. However, this rest was short-lived, as I soon woke up to the sound of my phone ringing. I answered the phone, and it was my boss. My boss told me that I was lucky I wasn't fired. Confused by this, I asked him why. He told me that I didn't show up to work yesterday, and that I better show up today if I wanted to keep my job. Before I could reply in any way, he had already hung up. I hurriedly got ready for work and called the cab company. As I waited for the cab to come, I smoked a cigarette. When the cab pulled up, I was surprised to see that the person driving it was not the morning driver, but the nighttime cab driver. I was even more surprised that he seemed to be in a great mood. Last night was a little odd, but at least today he seemed to be back to his normal and usual self. We chatted and laughed the whole drive to work, and it made me a lot less nervous about what I knew was going to be at the least an awkward conversation with my boss. As I walked into the building, the lobby pulsed with nervous energy, its very walls seeming to vibrate with my anxiety. I made my way to my boss's office, and I stood outside his door, mentally preparing myself for his lecture. Before I could enter his office, the door swung open, and as my boss emerged from the doorway, I was confused because he didn't seem to be angry like he was on the phone this morning. His eyes lit up as he saw me, and he said, "Good morning, Sean. I really appreciate you staying late yesterday." What should have been a moment of relief and even pride was instead a moment of confusion and dread, creating an uneasy feeling in my stomach. I was confused. I asked my boss why he called me this morning about me missing work the day prior. The smile that once seemed carved into his face dropped suddenly, replaced by a look of intense confusion. He tilted his head to the side and said, "I didn't call you this morning, Sean." The unease in my stomach intensified as I slid my hand into my pocket and pulled out my phone. "I'm pretty sure you did. Give me 1 second," I said. As my boss and I stood, each locked in this uncomfortable moment, I checked my call history. I saw that he did, in fact, call me this morning. "If you look right here, you'll see you did call me," I said to my boss as I handed him my phone. He took the phone and immediately froze. He looked at the phone. He looked at me. He looked back at the phone and giggled. "Sean, you do realize you handed me a dead phone, right?" He slid me back my phone and laughed as he said, "You're funny, Sean. I don't always understand your humor, but I know you're funny. Have a great work day." Before I could respond, he had already slid back into his office. Happy that I wasn't fired, I made my way to my desk. As I passed coworkers, they smiled at me, but I could feel their smiles fade the moment I looked away. I sat down at my desk and accidentally knocked over the bin. I want to put the bin upright, but I was thrown off by its color. As far back as I could remember, my trash bin, much like all the other bins in the office, was green. The bin that I was looking at was bright red. I heard a noise and looked up to see a coworker walking by. Their sudden presence startled me, and I blurted out, "New bins." My coworker looked at me like I was crazy before asking, "What?" I explained to my coworker that my bin has been replaced by a red one. My coworker looked at me bewildered and said something that I couldn't believe. "I've worked here for over 20 years. The bins have always been red." I stood up and looked at the other cubicles in the office, and sure enough, under each desk, every single bin was red. Still in disbelief, I pulled my bin from under my desk, and in the bin was a disposable coffee cup with my name written on the side. My mind reeled, and I was trying to make sense of the world around me, but it kept getting stranger. I slid my bin back under my desk and watched my coworker walk away, clearly annoyed. If my coworker would have walked away in a way that made sense, I might have been able to explain away all the other oddities I've been experiencing. What they did when they walked away, however, made no sense. I watched them walk to the back of the room by the printer and straight through the white wall. "What the fuck?" I said out loud as I walked to the same wall I had just watched my coworker vanish through. I reached out and touched it. The wall was solid. There was no way that what I saw was possible. Thinking about it made my head hurt, but I knew that something was wrong with either reality or my perception of it. I found my boss and told him that I needed to leave early for the day before I stepped outside and lit a cigarette. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and saw that it was fully charged. I called the cab company, and to my surprise, I heard a phone ring across the street from me. I looked up and saw the cab parked on the other side of the road. The driver waved me over. I crossed the street and I got in the cab. The driver looked familiar, but I couldn't remember his name. He was being very friendly, but there was something wrong with his face. I realized that while the cab driver's face looked happy and kind, his eyes looked wild and angry, almost demonic. I asked him what was wrong with his eyes, and he laughed in an octave I'd never heard before. For just a moment, the sky darkened, and I lost my ability to breathe. The car seemed to stand still as if time had frozen. The only proof that time wasn't frozen completely was the rapid beat of my own heart pounding in my chest. In that moment, I felt both like I was going to die and that whatever was happening wasn't ever going to stop. However, just as quickly as it came, the moment passed. I found myself shaking and staring through my fingers at the floor. I felt cold. I was afraid to look at the driver, for fear that I would not see a friendly face. I only dared look up when I heard the driver ask me a question. In a very normal and familiar voice, the cab driver asked me, "Hey buddy, are you okay?" I looked up and recognized him as the night driver for the cab company. I told him that I was fine, just a little ill. He mentioned a doctor he was going to call on my behalf. I told him that he didn't have to, but he really insisted. I thanked and paid the driver before stepping out of the cab. To my absolute horror, as I watched the cab drive away, it was rammed off of the road by a public bus. The bus slammed into the side of the cab forcefully, that for a moment it looked like they became one. Like some kind of vehicular hammerhead shark. I blinked hard and rubbed my eyes. When my eyes readjusted, I was able to see the cab driver turn the corner of the road, driving the cab completely undamaged. There was no bus, and there was no crash. My head hurts. I decided I needed to get home. I hurried into my apartment building. In the lobby, there was nobody. However, every apartment door now stood open, even mine. I walked through the door of my apartment, but as I crossed through, I felt cold before I exited through the front door of my office building. I was so afraid that my legs gave out and I fell on the ground. The cold concrete was a reminder that I was certainly not in my apartment. It was so cold that I instinctively jumped back up to my feet. I looked back at the building and it was closed. Everyone had gone home for the day. I checked my phone and this time it didn't turn on. Without another option, I decided that I would spend the evening on the bench under a light blanket of snow. I woke up early the next morning in my apartment, shivering in my warm bed. I checked my phone and realized that I was going to be late for work. I hurriedly got dressed and called the cab company. As I waited for the cab to come, I smoked a cigarette. When the cab driver arrived, I was nearing the end of my cigarette, so I flicked it into the street. As I entered, I noticed that it was a totally different cab driver. He didn't seem annoyed, but he didn't seem friendly. I assumed it must have been someone new. I asked what happened to the usual daytime driver, and the new cab driver told me that he was the only cab driver the company had, and as far as he knew, the company he worked for didn't offer rides after 5 p.m. because they only had one driver. This made no sense to me. I was sure he was new. As we rode in silence, I studied his face. It was totally unfamiliar. When he dropped me off at work, I tried to pay him, but he refused payment and gave me a card to call a doctor. I took it to be kind, but I wasn't planning on calling the doctor. As I stepped out of the taxi, I shuddered at the sight of the bench. I don't know if it was a dream or not that I spent the night there, but regardless, I wasn't a fan of that bench at that moment. I looked past the bench to my job. I was eager to get back to work and get my mind off of all the craziness. I walked in, but everyone was busy working, so nobody said hi. I did, however, catch some odd glances from people before they went back to their work. I sat down at my desk, but when I tried to log onto the computer, it told me my credentials were invalid. As I tried and failed to get into my work computer, I heard someone approaching. I looked up to see my boss coming with an angry look on his face and 2 armed security guards. I tell him that I'm struggling to get into my computer, and he says to me in an angry tone, "That's because it isn't your computer. You've never worked here." I felt dizzy when I heard those words. My boss had security escort me out of the building, and as I heard the doors lock behind me, I saw the bench covered in snow in an otherwise sunny environment that could only be described as summer-like. I wiped the snow off of the bench and reached into my pocket to grab my phone. Despite removing the snow, the bench was still cold and wet. I sat uncomfortably and called the cab. I smoked a cigarette while I waited for it to come. Once I was in the cab, I heard the driver say, "Short trip today." When I looked up, I was glad to see that it was the nighttime cab driver that I remembered. I was frightened by my job. I was frightened by my neighbors, and most days I was frightened by the cab. I wondered to myself when life got so incoherent and scary. My thoughts were interrupted by the driver letting me know that we arrived at my apartment. As I got out of the cab, I remembered that I had forgotten to pay him. So I reached into my pocket for my wallet, but I couldn't find it. When I turned around to see if I had left it in the cab, I saw that he had since left. I turned back around to face my apartment, and my heart sank. It was nighttime now, and I was standing in an empty lot where a building might have once stood, but where no building stood now. I stood alone in the lot and noticed snow falling. Not knowing where to go, I walked back toward the road where I found a familiar bench covered in snow. I wiped the snow away and laid down to rest. I closed my eyes, and as I drifted away from the world, I felt heavy and cold. I woke up to the sound of a car horn. It was the nighttime cab driver. He asked me if I was getting in or not. I chose to get in. It would be a nice break from the weather. He studied me from the side of his eye and asked, "Same place as usual?" I answered yes. And as we rode, he mentioned that I should call the doctor he gave me the card for. I thanked him again for the card and reassured him I would call the doctor. He gave me a kind nod and left. As he drove off into the distance, I watched him go, but nothing crazy or unexpected happened. Maybe I don't have to call that doctor, I thought to myself. I turned away from the road, but what I saw didn't make any sense at all. I saw that damn bench that I've suffered on so many times, and that was not a surprise to me. What surprised me, what shocked me to my core, was the decaying structure of what appeared to be a defunct, out-of-use building. The building looked similar to the one I work at, but it was in such a state of disrepair it would be hard to believe anyone has been there for years. I opened the front door, and the smell of still air made the place feel extra abandoned. I heard rhythmic tapping sounds from deeper into the building. I was so scared. I didn't want to search any further, but I felt like I had to. I had already gotten this far, and I wasn't sure of the alternative. I followed the sound of the typing. It grew louder as I drew closer. I was halfway to my destination when I realized where I was headed. I was a layer cake of dread and anxiety when I walked up to my desk. I peeked over the top of my desk, and I saw a man sitting in the dark, staring at a blank monitor, typing. I asked, "Who are you?" The man looked up at me with what I recognized as my own face before vanishing. My mind struggled to grasp what was going on in front of me. I stood alone in the dark above my rotting desk for what felt like an eternity as my mind reeled. I was about to turn away from the desk and leave. To run away from that desk, to run out of this building, to keep running until things made sense to me again. But as I went to turn away, the computer screen lit up the room. I turned back towards the computer and recognized the login screen. Not knowing what else to do, I put in my username and password. To my surprise, my credentials worked. The computer loaded up my desktop. All of my work files were still there, but when I clicked on them, they were all empty Word documents. Hundreds of professionally labeled blank files. Other than what was missing, there was also something new. A folder on my desktop labeled my diagnosis. All of this was too much. My mind ached, my eyes burned, my stomach hurt. I felt so cold, but I had to know what was in that folder. I clicked open the folder. Inside of the folder was a PDF file titled Patient File, Sean M. I clicked it open, and as I read the document, the words in the report burned in my mind. Patient name, Sean M. Current status, unemployed, homeless following eviction. Isolated. Diagnosis, chronic delusional disorder, severe. Current delusion. Structured employment as a data entry clerk for an imaginary insurance company. Uses the abandoned former work site as an anchor for the delusion. Daily behavior. Breaks into defunct job site. Sits at desk. Performs repetitive, meaningless actions. Typing on blank documents for 8 hours. Uses public transport. to maintain the illusion of financial autonomy. My stomach dropped out of my body. It wasn't my memory or the world that was broken. It was me. Every weird glance, every disappearing building, every change in the trash bin. It was all logged here in my own files. I dragged my eyes from the screen, looking around the dilapidated room again. No coworkers, no stacks of paper, just cold, still air. I felt the card that the cab driver had given me in my pocket. The weird things that have been happening have been terrifying, and the text on the screen was enough to seal the deal for me. I was done living this way. I was going to call the doctor. I pushed my hand into my pocket and pulled out the doctor's business card. I held it in my hand, studying it for a while. I knew that it was supposed to be a good thing, the thing that saves me, but it felt dangerous in my hand. I started dialing the number, but as I got to the third digit, I froze. I realized that I would be trading all of my comfort away for a reality I never agreed to participate in. I thought about how I would be trading all of my stability and everything I know for a tomorrow that was guaranteed to be worse. A reality where I didn't have a home, a job, or any friends. I didn't want to do that. I felt angry, sad, and confused, but I knew what I wanted to do. I tore the card to pieces, and as each piece fell, the room changed. Until suddenly I was sitting at my desk, surrounded by towering stacks of paperwork. On my desk was a fresh mocha coffee with my name on it. I sat down and started working. After I finished the first stack, I grabbed my coffee and took a sip. What I expected to taste and what I tasted were different things entirely. I was expecting to taste mocha, but when I took a sip of my coffee, the coffee was caramel. Story 6. Something's outside my apartment. I don't know if I'm losing my mind, but I need to write this somewhere before it gets worse. I live in a small 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, not quite the city, but not the countryside either. It's one of those complexes with identical beige buildings, a half-empty parking lot, and a chain-link fence separating it from a strip of woods that no one really goes into. The kind of place where people keep to themselves. I've been here for 2 years. It's quiet, which I like. Or at least it was. About 3 weeks ago, I started hearing this weird noise outside my window at night. Not just a random noise, it sounded like someone walking. Not heavy footsteps, but slow, dragging ones. Like bare feet on pavement. At first, I thought maybe it was one of my neighbors coming home late, or some raccoons going through the trash. But the sound didn't make sense. It would stop right beneath my window, stay there for a few minutes, and then move toward the fence that leads to the woods. After a few nights of that, I started looking out the blinds when I heard it, but I never saw anyone until the 5th night. That night, I was up late working on my laptop when I heard it again, slow, scraping steps on the sidewalk below. I peeked through the blinds. The motion light by the parking lot flicked on, and for a split second, I saw a figure standing near the fence. It was tall, too tall, and thin, but the proportions were wrong, like someone who had been stretched out. I could see its outline in the yellow light. It had long arms that hung lower than they should have, and its head tilted like it was listening. Then the light turned off, and it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I told my neighbor the next morning, a woman named Danielle who's lived here longer than I have. She looked uneasy when I mentioned the woods. She said she's heard weird noises too, especially around 2 or 3 in the morning. Crying, sometimes. Could be coyotes, she said, but her voice didn't sound convincing. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was an animal. I even left my phone recording one night while I slept, just to prove it was nothing. When I played it back the next morning, most of it was silence, until about 2:17 a.m. That's when I heard footsteps, then this sound like someone whispering really close to the microphone. It was too quiet to make out, but it almost sounded like my name. The next night, I left the phone recording again, but when I checked in the morning, the file was corrupted. Just static. Things got worse after that. I'd find a motion light by the parking lot on when I woke up, even though it's supposed to turn off automatically. My trash can got knocked over twice. Once when I stepped outside in the morning, I noticed what looked like handprints on my window. Not fingerprints, full, flat palms. Too long. The skin had left smudges like it was damp. I tried calling the building manager, but he brushed it off as kids messing around. Then about a week ago, I got home from work and found something sitting outside my door, a dead rabbit. Its body looked twisted, like its neck had been turned completely around. I didn't even touch it. I called maintenance, but when they came by, the body was gone. That night, I heard someone knock on my door around midnight. 3 slow knocks. When I looked through the peephole, no one was there, but I could hear breathing. It was deep and uneven, like someone trying to imitate what breathing should sound like. After maybe 30 seconds, it stopped. I didn't sleep again that night either. The next morning, I noticed muddy footprints leading from the front door to the sidewalk, bare feet, large ones, with toes that looked too long. Danielle moved out 2 days later. She didn't even tell anyone, just packed her car and left. I don't know what's happening here. Last night was the worst. Around 2:30 a.m., I woke up because I heard something tapping on my bedroom window. I live on the 2nd floor, so there shouldn't be anything tapping on my window. When I looked, I saw a face pressed against the glass. It was pale, almost gray, and the eyes were too big. The mouth was open, moving like it was trying to form words, but no sound came out. Then this part still makes my stomach turn. I realized it looked like me. The same eyes, the same hair, but wrong. Like someone wearing my face, but not knowing how to use it. I fell backward, hit the nightstand, and by the time I looked again, it was gone. I haven't told anyone else yet. I don't even know how to explain it. But tonight, as I'm typing this, I can hear it again, the dragging footsteps outside, moving up and down the sidewalk. Every few minutes, it stops right below my window. And I swear I just heard it whisper my name. Story 7. I was invited to explore an abandoned asylum. We never should have entered that place. I've always liked October and the Halloween vibes it brought. As I got older, I stopped being able to have the same kind of childish wonder towards the season. Watching scary movies late at night or going to haunted houses didn't feel the same. A coworker must have sensed this and offered that I join a group of his friends for a haunted asylum tour. I didn't know him very well, as we only worked together for 2 weeks. I debated whether I wanted to be with strangers for the night. It wasn't as if I had any other plans, so I accepted. He asked me to bring a camera, which he heard I owned. From the sounds of things, he wanted to record our outing and put it on his YouTube channel. I didn't care either way. The handheld camera had been a hand-me-down. It would be nice to finally use it outside of live events for coworkers. We met after work so he could drive us to this building. I've never heard of an asylum being within driving distance, I told him on the way. It was shut down after a lot of abuse was uncovered. And I mean a lot of nasty stuff. The city did everything it could to wipe the records of the place. And locals don't like talking about it because a lot of their older relatives worked there. Brian explained as he drove. I nodded as I half listened. I hadn't even been able to find the name online. They must have done a great deal of scrubbing to erase this place so well. Since I wasn't paying much attention and focused more on my phone during the drive, I didn't know where we ended up. The road slowly became surrounded by trees, then turned into a dirty pathway I wasn't certain we should be driving along. This building was really out of the way. The trees finally parted, and I could see a massive building on top of a hill that Brian's car struggled against. Some other cars were already waiting for us. A full moon shone between clouds, and a slight breeze caused colored leaves to drift across the unkempt lawn. The white paint peeled off the front of the stone walls, and most of the dark windows were broken. This place looked like it came straight out of a bad horror movie. At least I would be getting my Halloween fill this season. We parked with the other 2 cars, and Brian started to introduce everyone. There would be 7 people in total. Kayla, a girl he's known since high school, waved when we walked over. Ryan worked with Brian at their last job. He didn't appear overly excited about the entire idea. I got the sense he was somehow bribed to be here. Liam and his sister arrived next in the same car. They were both tall, and within seconds of meeting them, I got the impression they could be friends with anyone. The last person arrived a few minutes after them, saying how they almost got lost. Okay, good, we're all here. Everyone wearing proper footwear? There are a lot of rusty nails and broken glass inside. How about flashlights? Brian started looking over the group. Most of us had our cell phones for flashlights. He didn't want us using up our batteries, so he handed out small pen lights as well as some walkie-talkies. I was impressed by all of this. Even though I was only working with him for a short time, I didn't have a very high opinion of his work ethic. When he was motivated, it seemed like he thought things through. Are you going to split up and explore in groups? Kayla asked, sounding nervous. No, not if you don't want to. It's up to you guys. I brought the radios just in case. This place is a maze, so it's easy to get lost. Our new friend Benny here will be recording for us. But it would be nice if you guys could as well if you do decide to go off alone. I winced at the nickname. I've asked him 100 times not to call me that. Just Ben was fine. I used my flashlight to look over the side of the building and noticed something I hadn't before. From the tops of the windows, a blackness had curled up and stained the sides. A familiar smell came to the air. Was there a fire here? I asked. For some odd reason, Brian's face grew a little pale. I heard there was one, but it was put out before too much damage was done. I think sometimes homeless people camp here. I don't know why he sounded a little stressed over my question. I ignored it, and Kayla spoke up. Are we going to come across anyone inside? She said a little frightened over the idea. Nah, a new shelter opened up, remember? Why would they camp in this place when they have access to warm meals and a free bed? Brian shrugged. Well, just in case no one should go off alone. Let's get everyone's numbers, if we drop the radio or something. Liam suggested. For the next few minutes, we did just that. I realized that most of these people knew Brian, but this was the first time they were meeting each other. I wasn't the odd person out in this group. Everyone ready? Brian asked and got a positive response. A cold wind blew, almost ushering our group inside. An odd feeling came into my stomach as I suddenly wanted to turn back and go home. I shook my head, refusing to back out now. Besides, Brian was my ride. Lifting the handheld camera, I followed behind the group, unaware of what waited for us inside. The lobby was massive with cracked tiles. It opened to a large set of wooden stairs that branched out, leading to opposite sides of the building. Our footsteps echoed through the room. Liam and his sister walked ahead of the group to the front desk. He leaned over, looking through the papers that were left behind. They must have closed down suddenly. I think these files have some personal information that shouldn't be left out for anyone to see, he commented, placing the dirty papers back down. It is weird. I've never heard of this place. One of the group commented. Yeah, you would think it would be a huge local legend or something. Another person chimed in. Which side do you want to start with? Brian asked, ignoring the previous questions. Right. Left. Two sets of voices came at the same time. After a quick game of rock, paper, scissors, it was decided we would go left. From the looks of things, the rooms for the staff were on the right, and the patients were on the left. Any treatment rooms were in the basement, and the common areas were on the first floor. It would be impossible for us to look at the entire building in one night. Let's look at the left side, and then go to the basement for the good stuff. Brian said, and we all agreed. We made our way upstairs, the group chattering away, ruining the atmosphere. It wasn't overly upset over that. Sure, I didn't want a spooky night out, but after nearly an hour of recording banter and silly antics of the group, I found myself preferring this kind of night over what I expected. Each room we peeked into was more or less the same. Ruined beds with some personal items left behind. It looked like everyone just got up and left. Each item is slowly being overtaken by the elements. Weird how there isn't any graffiti, I commented as we walked down the hallway. Another burst of wind blew through the broken windows, creating a ghastly sound that made some of the group shudder. Oh, you're right. Kayla agreed, looking at the bare and painted walls. A strong smell of something burnt came with the wind, and I found myself covering my nose with my hand. Liam noticed and sniffed the air. What's up? Are you feeling sick? He asked. I shook my head, looking around, trying to find the source of the smell. No, it's like something is on fire. Am I the only one who... I stopped as I looked over the group. It was dark, but with our flashlights I could see everyone. I counted 6 people. 6? I started looking inside rooms, trying to find a last person. We had been introduced, and yet I couldn't remember their name to call out for them. Are you sure you're not feeling sick? Liam asked, watching me as I darted between rooms. A cold fear came to my chest as I pushed by him and opened a door. Inside was a large operating room. Tools scattered along the floor, an old, massive light hanging overhead, a stained steel table. I left the door open and went to the room next to it. A doctor's office was inside, with an overturned bookcase and files littering the floor. I thought we were in the patient's living area. Why is there an operating room here? I asked, unable to hide the stress in my voice. I saw the small group glance over, faces pale at the realization. Maybe, Kayla started, but couldn't think of an answer. Wasn't there 7 of us? I finally said. They all appeared confused. Liam slowly nodded and glanced down at his phone. That was right. We all got each other's numbers. The last person's name should be there. I took out mine, looking at the small contact list. 6 new numbers. I raised my head, meeting Liam's eyes. He was as scared as I felt. I think it's time to leave, I told him sternly. He took hold of his sister's hand, ready to drag her out if needed. Why? Because you can't count? It was always the 6 of us, right? Brian said. I narrowed my eyes on him. For some odd reason, it sounded like he was trying to convince us. Was this a prank they were playing on the new guy? No. I remember adding 7 contacts to my phone. It hadn't left my pocket. Someone couldn't delete it. And everyone here wasn't friends with each other. Only Brian. Movement at the end of the hallway caught my eye. Lifting the flashlight, the beam fell on a dirty gown. The figure hunched over, skin black and cracked. Lifting its head, it looked at us with bright orange eyes as the smell of smoke and burnt meat filled the hallway. Prank or not, I wasn't going to risk it. Run, I shouted, and it caused everyone to move at once. I heard screaming as we stumbled over each other. In the chaos, I dropped the handheld camera, but I didn't care. Brian did. He scooped it up and then darted inside one of the side rooms. My vision was blurred as I ran as fast as I could, trying to get out of this damn place. No matter how many times we turned a corner in the hallway, we couldn't seem to find the stairs. If something was following us, I didn't see it, but I smelled something burnt close by. This isn't getting us anywhere, Liam said and pulled his sister into a side room. We followed him, out of breath and faces stained with sweat. The room was small and could barely hold all of us. It looked like a solitary confinement cell with scratches on the cement wall. When we calm down, we'll find a window and get out that way, Liam explained after gasping for some air. I looked around to see who was inside the room. Kayla, Liam, his sister, and me. We were missing a person. Damn it. I hissed and checked my phone. His name was still there, which was good. Did you see where Ryan went? I asked the group. Each appeared confused over the question, almost as if they didn't know who I was talking about. I almost forgot him, Kayla whispered, clearly scared of what was going on. Liam gripped his sister's hand tighter. We didn't understand what was going on, only that we needed to get the hell out of here. Okay, we really need to find a window, he said, and we all agreed. Thankfully, the next room had one. It was broken, and Liam wrapped his hand in a torn bedsheet to remove the rest of the pieces around the edges to make it safer. He put his head through, looking out with his flashlight, gauging the distance. We're on the 2nd floor, I think, he told us. Won't we, break something if we jump? Can we find a bedsheet to tie together? Or... Kayla offered. We had closed the door behind us. A sudden scratching noise came from it as the door handle started to turn. I threw my body against the door, keeping it shut as a burst of heat came from the other side. Better a broken leg than whatever is outside, I said, straining against the force, trying to get in. She nodded, and Liam went to try to fit through the window. To his horror, his shoulders were too large. Ducking out, he took hold of his sister and held her through. His face was full of stress as he lowered her out. She promised that since she was a cheerleader in high school, she knew how to fall properly. He took a few deep breaths, then finally let go of her hand, letting her body drop off into the darkness. The rattling and the heat on the other side of the door disappeared when she did. Liam stood by the window, an almost calm expression coming over his face. He turned to us, looking over the 2 other people in the room. Who's going to go first? He offered. Dread came to my stomach. My shoulder hurt from keeping the door shut. I pushed back the pain to ask a question I hoped had a good answer. Shouldn't we see if your sister landed, all right? I asked him, my voice strained. Liam's expression turned to confusion. Sister, he asked. I found myself sliding down the wooden door. Kayla choked back sobs and looked away from Liam. Going out a window wasn't an option, and we just lost a person because of it. Liam hadn't fully forgotten her, but her number was no longer in my contact list. Maybe there was a slight chance she would be all right. We just needed to get out of here. All right, let's keep going. I finally stood up. Where? Kayla asked, defeated. Why don't we stay here? People will notice that we're missing. I crossed my arms, wanting more than anything for a rescue party to come and save the day. no matter how much I wanted to believe that I already knew it would be impossible. Where are we? I mean, what's the name of this asylum? I asked them. Shock then sheer horror came over their faces. They didn't know. No matter how hard we tried, we could not remember the name of this place. That meant no one would be coming to save us. As hard as it was to accept, something natural was happening. I agree with Ben. I think if we try hard enough, we can get out of here, Liam said and walked over to Kayla, taking her hand. I did the same, trying to give her a comforting expression. From what I've gathered, once we separate, we forget about each other. We won't let you go, I told her, trying to smile. Tears were in her eyes. With a deep inhale, she squeezed our hands, a new determination in her eyes. I'm not some scared little girl. I won't let you guys be kidnapped. She huffed. I was glad that I was with these two. I swore that no matter what, we would get out of here. Slowly, I opened the door into the dark hallway. Keeping a hand around Kayla's waist, Liam shone his flashlight down the hallway. A dark shape was a few feet away from us. It didn't react, so we wisely decided to go the other way. We walked down the empty hallway, with closed doors on each side. I kept looking behind us at the figure to make sure it wasn't going to chase after us. I glanced at the room numbers and noticed we were now on the 3rd floor. I had an idea, I whispered to them. We shuffled into a room, closed the door, then I opened it, peeking out into the new hallway. Every time we went inside a room and left, we ended up in a different part of the building. Even some rooms might be inside different areas, like the operating room appearing on the 2nd floor. Maybe if we go in and out of enough rooms, we might end up on the 1st floor, I told them. Liam nodded, glad that we had some sort of plan. I have no idea how long we moved like that, ducking between rooms in a useless attempt to get outside. While inside a patient's room, Kayla paused at a dusty dresser. It's a cell phone number, she pointed out. Someone had recently written a number in the dust on the dresser. Has Brian been here? I checked my phone and saw it wasn't a number on my contacts list. Was it from someone we were missing? Before I could enter, an overpowering smell came into the room. Our backs had been turned to the bed. We moved too late. A hand came down, gripping Liam's shoulder so hard it made him crumble to the ground. The creature was a thin creature with charred flesh sticking to its frame. Kayla screamed as a burned patch started to spread along Liam's shoulder, melting away part of his shirt. My body froze as I met the creature's eyes. My entire soul was suddenly filled with so much sorrow, I couldn't move. I couldn't think. Tears sting my eyes, and I was positive we would have died there if it weren't for the 3rd person in the room. Kayla found a broken piece of a wooden chair in the corner. She grabbed the thickest part and swung it like a bat. It shattered on the creature's skull, snapping the head back so far that I thought it would come off. It screamed and then disappeared into the floor, leaving its attacker panting with a broken piece of wood in her hands. I want to see how Liam was. It took a minute before he was able to stand up. The burn was not as bad as it could have been. Thanks, we told Kayla, a little bit in shock over her outburst. Let's just find a weapon and just smash the shit out of all the scary bastards in here, she said, her green eyes shining in the darkness. I now would much rather deal with whatever monsters were in the dark than ever have her angry at me. Well, I started and didn't need to finish that thought. Countless darkened, burned hands came from the walls, reaching for us. As much as Kayla wanted to fight back, she was no match for this. We grabbed hold of her, and the 3 of us hauled ass back into the hallway. We almost ran over another one of those darkened creatures. It reached out with thin arms, hands like claws ready to rip into flesh. We avoided it and ended up weaving between more of those things. We were on the move, and stopping meant being overtaken by a swarm of hands that wanted to rip flesh from bones. As we ran, I kept seeing the same cell phone number written along the walls and on the floors. I didn't have time to stop and call it. We crashed into another operating room, shortly realizing our mistake. So many of those burnt bodies squirmed through the only exit. Kayla grabbed an 4-pole to keep the mass back as Liam used the steel table to create some distance. A hand landed on my wrist. I grabbed a scalpel from the table, ready to bring it down on my attacker. Our eyes met, and for that single moment, I wasn't looking at a monster. Instead, I stared at a scared young girl asking for help. The blade dropped from my hands. As if in a trance, I reached out for her, barely aware of the burning coming from where her hand touched my wrist. I suddenly wanted to hold her, to tell her I would get her out of this place. Those things would be all right. A hand took hold of the back of my shirt. I found myself falling as the floor gave out. The three of us tumbling down somewhere unknown. I must have been knocked out. I felt a warm hand on my cheek and a voice asking if I was all right. Opening my eyes, I saw we were in an empty room with a ceiling so high I couldn't see the top. It felt more like a pit than a room. Sitting up, I say Kayla, sitting next to me. Some scratches and bruises, but she was all right. Liam wasn't doing as well. The burn on his shoulder spread. He sat against the wall, barely able to keep his eyes open. Another person was in the room with us. Brian was on his back, blood on his forehead, eyes closed as he clutched the camera, as if his life depended on it. A large steel door took up most of the left wall. I could hear inhuman yowling from the other side as it got closer. I don't know how to get out of here, Kayla admitted. I took her hand, wishing I had the answers. The way out wouldn't just fall into our laps, right? I found this when we went here. She nodded toward the piece of yellowing paper nailed to the stone wall. It had the same cell phone number she saw before. We looked at each other, deciding if it was worth the risk. From the sounds of things and the heat coming from the steel door, we didn't have a lot of time to think about it. I pulled out my phone, thankful it still had power left. I had to try 911 first. Nothing. I then tried the mystery number. After a few rings, someone finally answered. Took you long enough. The person snapped. We all jumped because the voice was inside the room with us. I got between the newcomer and Kayla, uncertain if I could defend her from them. No matter how hard I looked at them over, I could not figure out their gender. They were thin with messy red hair cut at their shoulders. A tight black sleeveless workout shirt clings to every muscle and shows off a flat chest, as well as how thin they were. A set of baggy khakis didn't match the shirt. Neither did a pair of slim high-heeled shoes. One was standing on Brian's chest. "Who?" I asked, stunned at the newcomer's appearance. "Jake," they responded. "Jake is a little hot." Kayla whispered in my ear. I gave her a raised eyebrow, but didn't say anything. She'd been through enough tonight. She didn't need me judging her. "Get up, you little shit." Without warning, Jake kicked Brian hard enough to send his body rolling. He gasped, clutching his sore side. He spotted the camera he'd let go of and then scrambled for it. Hake reached it first, the heels coming down, smashing it to pieces. "You bitch!" Brian yelled, ready to attack her. A strong leg came out, knocking him senseless. I sat, not wanting to get in between any of this. From the looks of things, these two had met before. "Hurry up and get us out of here. I'll give you anyone here that you want," Brian said between bloody teeth. Jake crossed her arms, a nasty look on her face. She had a scar on one side of her lip that made it look like a gruesome smile, even while frowning. "You've done this before." Liam is struggling to speak. I felt so stupid. Brian had lured us all here for what? For footage for his dumb YouTube channel? He already knew how to travel through rooms to avoid those monsters, and he already planned on calling Jake, offering whoever was left to save his own skin. He has. I offered to save him, and this guy paid with his girlfriend, Jake said, curling a piece of bright red hair between her fingers. She was a cutie. I guess he thought he could pull the same shit twice. "Kayla is cute. Take her," Brian said, standing up only to get his legs swept out from under him. "I do this kind of thing for fun. Listening to your whiny demands isn't fun. Besides, you weren't the one who called me, so I don't need to listen to whatever you want," she said, crossing her arms again, and her eyes landed in my direction. My heart started a race. We could get out of here. I just needed to deal with this childish weirdo. "You can do whatever you want with me. Just save Dash," I started, and Jake gave another scowl. "Boring," she hissed, turning her nose up to my offer. I looked over at Liam, knowing he didn't have a lot of time left. Even if there weren't monsters at the door ready to break it down, he needed help fast. "There were 7 of us," I started, and Jake glanced over almost interested. "I don't remember the 7th, but I know Ryan's name and that Liam was here with his sister. Are they still alive?" I asked, hoping for answers. Jake appearing out of thin air and her overall vibe gave me the impression she wasn't normal. Maybe she knew more about this place than we did. "Yes." The people who die here become a part of this place. They are wiped from existence, like how all the patients were. This isn't a real place. It's an amalgamation of the suffering of the ones who died because of the system they were forced into. Jake explained and sounded almost normal. I assume it lets certain people know about it, because it wants to lure in new victims. I nodded, then frowned. They weren't all fully forgotten. Didn't some of them have families on the outside? Even being buried in an unmarked grave or burned, there must be someone out there who remembers some of these people. I was mostly talking to myself. The creatures who chased us weren't monsters, just someone who had been hurt by the real monsters. Is there any way to help them? I asked, and it caused Jake to burst out into cruel laughter. I'm reconsidering your offer. You cannot help them here. You'll only be dragging them into their pain. The only way to help is to make the public aware of the abuse people suffered in these systems. To do that, you need to get out. Now, what are you going to offer me to make it worth my time? She stood tall, hands on her hips, with a smug look on her face. She held all the cards, and I needed to figure out what she wanted. You could do whatever you want with me, I said, and got a nasty look as a response. I then pointed a finger over to Brian. And you can have him, I finally said. He shot up, bloodshot face red with rage. You can't just hand me over like that, he shouted, looking as if he might strangle me. Jake might eat me, or worse. I'm offering myself to save all of you. You guys owe me your lives. Since you owe me, I'm offering you as well, I said, only making Brian even more furious. That's stupid. It doesn't make sense. He snapped, stomping a foot. You're right. And I like stupid. Okay, done deal. I assume you want those other two? Hang on. Without warning, Brian fell through the floor with a yelp. Jake followed after leaving the room, silent for a few seconds. Suddenly, Liam shot up, facing a mixture of pain and confusion. My sister. Where is she? I dropped her but dash. Kayla went over to him and helped him back to the ground. Jake appeared without the two other people we were missing. She told us they were outside and that she just needed to get us free next. You'd better be worth it. This will take a lot out of me. She huffed and walked towards the door, her heels clicking. Get ready to run. With some effort, I got Liam on my back. There was no other option. Kayla steadied herself. She knew that if I was falling behind, I wanted her to leave us. I would rather one person get out of this place alive. Jake threw open the door to hell on the other side. Countless bodies were crammed into each other, screaming and reaching for warm living bodies. A burst of flames shot out from Jake's mouth, her hair glowing as bright as the flames in front of her. The screaming grew louder as the bodies caught fire. My eyes water and my skin sting from the heat. We pressed on, knowing we would die if we stopped. Jake cackled as she ran, each heel denting the floor from the force of her footsteps. A sleek body darted around the room, flames coming from her mouth and hands setting fire to anything that tried to attack us. We ran hard, my body straining against the weight on my back. I refused to leave Liam behind. We reached a set of stairs that felt endless. A fiery, cackling maniac led the way as so many hands clamored after us, nipping at our heels. We finally arrived at the lobby, the end in sight. A sea of bodies came flooding down the stairs, threatening to engulf us. Jake put herself between us, feet firmly planted, ready to set forth the largest blast of flames that could take down the entire building. Kayla got through the doors first, followed her, and set Liam down on the cold steps. She shouted as I turned on my heels to go back inside. I'd seen something in that crowd of crying flesh I refused to leave behind. Jake was already unleashing a sea of flames. I pushed through it, feeling the heat on my flesh and my shirt burning away. My hands reached out into the bodies, taking hold of the small hand. With the last of my strength, I pulled the thin person into my arms, and the heat overtook everything. I woke up on the cool grass, a foot painfully nudging my side. Opening my eyes, I saw a brightening sky and Kayla's worried face. Jake already took everyone to be treated. I thought you weren't going to wake up, she explained. I sat up with my entire body in pain. I wasn't as burned as I thought, mostly a sunburn on my arms. Next to me was a human-shaped bundle wrapped in a dirty sheet. The building was missing, leaving the hillside empty. I couldn't leave her behind. I told Kayla, placing a hand on the bundle next to me. Soft boys like you tend to get swept up into places like these. You're lucky I could pull you out of it, Jake said, very annoyed. Thank you, I told her. Her face flushed in a way I wasn't expecting. You're lucky I'm so nice. In fact, I'm so nice I'll take the body you saved and make sure she's buried properly. I was glad for the offer. I doubted I could show up with a random corpse and ask the police to identify her without there being a lot of questions. What do I owe you? I asked, almost scared of the answer. Jake paused, thinking almost as if she wasn't sure. She made a scene of muttering to herself and puttering around. Pancakes, she finally said. Kayla and I looked at each other with a matching expression. There's a breakfast place I've been wanting to try, but it's only open in the mornings. I never wake up before noon. Buy me some and bring them over, and we're even. Jake nodded. That's it, I said, mentally kicking myself after I asked. What? Did you want me to like you, eat you or something? You don't have an ounce of meat on your bones, and it would take too long to fatten you up. With that last comment, she tossed a set of keys into my lap that belonged to Brian's car. Thank you, I told her again, and she stuck her tongue out as if I said something disgusting. I still had her cell phone number, so we could figure out the pancake day and how many she wanted. I might be stuck delivering breakfast to this weirdo for a long while, and I was perfectly all right with that.